I'm Jess. I'm from the United States, specifically currently in Philadelphia, and I'm 24 years old. I think that's a great question. And something that I'm always thinking about is how do we get young people at the table? And a question like this is really difficult, I think, because for a lot of young people, we're interested, we understand that technology has been part of our lives since we were growing up. I don't even remember a world without some of the platforms and technologies that exist today that I use every day. But I think that even though it's in the news and it's in headlines all the time, that data governance is important and that we need to find solutions to some of these things that we know are having a direct impact on our lives. It's really hard to figure out how to get involved just because it seems like there are so few opportunities or it's so hard to get in the door. When it comes to, as a young person living in the United States, I know that my government representatives aren't even necessarily attuned to some of these issues themselves. And therefore, I have questions about how do I bring some of these ideas or bring some of my concerns to the table if the people who are actually making decisions aren't even aware of them themselves or don't necessarily have the infrastructure in place to receive proper comments or things along those lines. I have a lot more faith and excitement about international organizations and multilaterals that have kind of already put a stake in the ground and said, hey, this is something that we're working on. And I know that there exist a bunch of youth forums, various different programs for young people to get involved. But still, I think, especially in the United States, and as somebody that has kind of worked around these topics for a really long time, it still feels like there are barriers to entry to actually, making an impact. Then my number one recommendation, I'm speaking as somebody that lives in the United States and understands the context of kind of lawmakers here, but also has seen models elsewhere in the world. I think that the number one thing is that if we're going to be creating different regulations or coming up with new ideas for how to handle data, we also need to understand how data works and how technology works. And I think that how can we have people make decisions if they're not even aware about how mechanisms work, how technologies work, or even what the impacts are. So I think that education is extremely important, and education in a way that resonates with audiences and the various needs of, a lawmaker's constituents. So I think that that's like something that I think about broadly. I think that another thing that is really important is that we need representation at the table. And, not necessarily with regards to data governance, but this week we've had kind of a lot of conversations about even like company boards working at AI companies like OpenAI, where people are outraged, but the board is comprised of basically white men. And that's not demonstrative of the populations that are being affected by these technologies. And I think that if we're going to start somewhere, we also need to make sure that at the beginning of conversations, various perspectives, various groups, various identities, various cultures are represented at the table, because otherwise we're going to get halfway down a policymaking process without the proper insights kind of embedded in from day one. And we're going to be left with populations who experience different results due to various data governance policies or various things happening with technology, and those needs aren't going to be met and the harms are not going to be reduced. So I think those are two things that I think about. Well, I grew up going to public school in the States, and my school is very technology forward. But, I have nightmares sometimes about how my school, we learned all these different online programs. We made a bunch of design boards online. We used different software tools. We had accounts created left and right for us, experimenting with different things. And I'm still a little plagued by just how much information of my own growing up is probably existing out there online without me even realizing it. And that as a student in school, I didn't really even have the awareness to say, maybe this is something I should be careful about or opt out of. Of course, I knew the normal, don't post things that are inappropriate online, be kind to others, don't engage in cyberbullying. But even things like my birthday, my email, my location, my age are just out there in pockets on websites that who knows what they even were. And I think that that's something that I'm grateful that I was learning programming languages in school, and I was using different softwares and doing a lot of design work, like using apps like Figma to design wireframes and learning how to develop new presentations. But I did not have that awareness whatsoever about the actual data that I was producing myself, or where it was potentially being used, and also who had access to it, especially thinking about things like the data broker economy. So I think that that's something that I wish there had been more awareness about growing up, or at least, the onus wasn't on me as a 12-year-old in school to really be necessarily aware of that, but I wish that my educators had been aware of kind of what they were setting the ground for. So I think that those are some things growing up. And then in college, I was really grateful. I went to Duke, and they had a requirement that we had computational education in some regard. And they also required that we had different social science ethics courses. So I did a lot of coursework that involved programming languages, like Python, the classic like stats languages like R, but also I was using tools like Unity for video game design. And in pretty much all of those courses, while also learning, there was some type of acknowledgement about data management, data security, what are we actually building, who's going to be affected. And the school really emphasized kind of this combination of social sciences and technology, and making sure that what you were building, you understood the social implications. And I'm really grateful for that. And I think that it's actually a really easy thing to do. If you're teaching an introductory computer science class, or you're having a conversation about healthcare innovation, or just really anything, it's really easy to throw in like one lesson addressing some of the risks and the harms that can exist, but also like opportunities to provide better experiences, better security, better safety to users. So yeah, those are some of the things that I think about with like my own educational journey. And I'm also very acutely aware of the fact that that was at like a really big leading research university with a lot of resources and funding to pursue some of these projects. Especially, I think something that I think about is when I look at some of these, like big nonprofits or policy organizations or big research institutes focusing on things like data governance, they're usually catering to pretty elite academic circles or elite multilateral circles. And something that I think about is like, how do we get somebody who's being educated at the local community college, which provides an amazing education and great springboard for a career, but how do we get funding funneled to some of those institutions who are equally as the care is definitely needed to have that involved in the education, and it's just like the resources aren't there right now. So I think a lot about how we can get it there. This is something that I also think about, because I think that I was fortunate enough to not get an Instagram account until I was in middle school, but I see kids nowadays are like in 4th grade, 3rd grade, and they're already using their iPhones and posting things, and being exposed to content, maybe even especially now because of these like recommendation algorithms, they're being exposed to content that is really inappropriate, not age appropriate, could also be very anxiety inducing, particularly as things like wars and conflicts and violence are now like being live streamed on the internet, and social media platforms are struggling to catch up in moderating that content. I think that it's really challenging, but I think that even as like a full-fledged adult or young adult, still like I think that what you see and the images that you consume stick with you, whether you want them to or not. And I've seen particularly throughout COVID for my generation and my peers, everybody became glued to social media platforms and to various online content. And we had an entire 1.5, like 2-year period where everything we were consuming was coming through our computers just due to the state of the world. And it really concerns me, because I think that I particularly think about the effects on young women and men when it comes to body dysmorphia, when it comes to beauty standards, when it comes to being exposed to violent imagery, and not having the proper tools of how to handle it. And it concerns me too about how platforms struggle to catch up and actually catching some of the content that's spreading. I think about misinformation, and I think that it can feel very overwhelming for young people, because I do think that we have an awareness that these things are happening, but we just don't feel like we have any power in stopping it or figuring out what's going on, especially because these big tech behemoths like we're both reliant on them for connection and for engagement with the world, especially as so many things become digital, but they're also in some ways like our own worst enemies. And they're kind of perched far away in Silicon Valley, making decisions that are opaque and we're not really sure what's going on. So I think it's a really, really hard environment for young people to be navigating. And it's harder because the adults too don't really know how to fix it. So I think that we're all trying to figure it out. But it's great. And I think that some of these threads, like education and mental health, are of course top of mind for a lot of young people. And I think that it's a great way of framing kind of some of these conversations. Like data governance policy might not resonate with young people per se, but I think like, young people are seeing their friends experience anxiety and depression from various things that they're seeing online. People understand that the TikTok algorithm is not always helpful. And I think framing it in those ways and saying, hey, these are real harms that are existing or risks that are existing in your life, and you can do something about it. I think that's like a great way to think about it.